Welcome back. Well, in just over 100 days, the UK will face the next Brexit deadline, and both candidates have said they want to see a new deal done in that time. But is it possible? Well, joining us now is the Brexit Secretary Stephen Barclay. Thank you for being on the show this morning, Mr. Barclay.
Good morning.
So have you picked up any shift in the EU's position, particularly Ireland's position recently?
Well, there's a positive tone struck by Simon Coveney in the press this morning. Clearly, the EU recognise it's in their interest to avoid a no deal. A no deal outcome will be very damaging across the EU. And so both sides want to secure a deal, and it will be the task of the new Prime Minister to have those discussions. But I think the EU recognise it's in both sides' interest to get to that outcome.
It's been reported that you told the EU's Brexit negotiator, Michel Barnier, 5 times in a recent meeting that the withdrawal agreement is dead. Now, I'm sure you won't comment on private meetings, but in your view, is the withdrawal agreement dead?
Well, I certainly wouldn't need to make the same point 5 times in the same meeting, so I think that gives you a clue. But what I said is exactly what I said to the Select Committee, and no one on the Select Committee, which is a cross-party committee of members of Parliament, disagreed, which is that the current text of the withdrawal agreement, if nothing at all is changed, then I didn't see that going through the House of Commons. It's been rejected 3 times. Since then, we've had the European elections where, if anything, the House has further polarised. And so what I was very openly and honestly sharing with them was an update on the political scene in London. And I think if the text isn't changed in any way, it's difficult to envisage how that will go through the House of Commons.
So if the withdrawal agreement is dead, if the EU is saying that it's not open for renegotiation, that it does look as if we could be heading towards a no-deal Brexit if Boris Johnson becomes Prime Minister and is determined to take the UK out by that deadline in October. Now, that is something the Chancellor says will cost the UK £90 billion. Is that a price worth paying?
Well, the figure you quote relates to a Treasury forecast for 2035, a full 15 years after the end of the implementation period. And it also assumes that the government would take absolutely no action in response to a new deal. Well, as the Chancellor knows, and as I know, there are teams currently working in the Treasury on exactly what options we will take if we were in the position of a no-deal outcome. So those teams wouldn't be working in the way they are if the intention of the government was not to take action. So there is a forecast there. There's a load of forecasts that have been put out in recent weeks. The reality is a no deal would be disruptive, but we've got over 300 teams across Whitehall working on our preparations, whilst it remains our priority to secure a deal if the EU are willing to move on that.
It's not just any forecast, though, is it? It's a cross-government forecast, including by your department, that you actually presented to Parliament that was published by your department in November. I mean, surely we have to trust these figures.
No, it wasn't presented by myself, and what I'm saying is it's a forecast that's based on no action being taken by government, when I think everyone, including the Chancellor, would accept that in the event of no deal, then of course the government would take action. And it's also a forecast to 2035, which I think your viewers will know. Any forecast 15 years after the implementation period can only be treated with a certain degree of questioning. So there are limits to what can be forecast. We know that from each budget. The issue is what action would the government take in the event of no deal, and across government we're preparing extremely seriously to ensure that the new Prime Minister has the options he needs.
Now, you, of course, are looking after preparations for no deal. It's something that we know Boris Johnson would like to see a big advertising campaign around to make sure that businesses are prepared. In your view, are businesses doing enough to make sure they can mitigate any problems associated with a no-deal Brexit?
Well, I think what Boris absolutely gets is there's a difference between the preparation of many large firms and the current position of many other small and medium-sized firms. I think just as government has over 300 teams working on this, a lot of large firms have been working for several years to prepare. And if I look at sectors such as the pharmaceutical sector, a huge amount of work has been done. I think where things are not as advanced is in the small business sector, where many small businesses hear members of Parliament, hear the message coming out of Parliament where people say that no deal will be taken off the table and therefore assume that they don't need to prepare. And that's the particular area where we will need to focus our communications moving forward.
I mean, what kind of things should businesses be doing? Should they be looking at stockpiling, for example?
Well, the border flow, you only need to stockpile if there's issues, for example, at the short straits between Dover and Calais, and
Which
a
we
huge
think
amount
there
of
may
work
be
has
in a
gone
no
in. The
deal.
French have put in, well, we expect some disruption, but far less than was envisaged in March, so the forecasts have improved considerably. So it's a mix between stockpiling, flow, and what other actions we can take. And that's exactly the sort of thing we've been looking at in our preparations, having a lot of roundtables, a lot of meetings with industry in order to get that right. But there'll be a mix between stockpiling, but also in terms of how we get goods through the container ports, what action we take at Dover Calais. The French authorities have also taken action. But Sophie, this isn't just a UK problem. Around 40% of Ireland's exports go through Dover. So it's not just UK goods that would be stuck at Dover. It would also be the goods of EU 27 member states, and in particular the Irish would be acutely affected if there were delays there. So this is a shared challenge, and that's why it's in both sides' interest to come to sensible, early, reciprocal arrangements to keep the flow of goods moving through the short straits.
According to the Sunday Times, if there is a no deal, then medicines will be prioritised travelling through Dover, followed by medical equipment and then fresh food. Is that right?
Yeah, we've said that repeatedly. I don't think that's a revelation. Category 1 goods, first and foremost, start with medicines. There'll be some DEFRA products as well. A huge amount of work has gone in by the Department of Health and Social Care on that, working with the pharmaceutical industry. And we're in very good shape in terms of the work that's gone on, particularly within that. That's also why we put in place, and we had a written ministerial statement in Parliament a couple of weeks ago, a framework to enable us to procure additional capacity, should that be necessary, in the autumn. We're acutely aware that it's essential that we maintain the flow of medicines through the short straits. But again, there's actually more medicines that go out to Europe from the UK than come in from Europe into the UK. So this is, again, a shared issue that it's in both sides' interest to get right.
And how should we as individuals be preparing for the thought of a no-deal Brexit? I mean, are we safe to book holidays in Europe in the autumn? Or would you really hold off for a bit?
Yes, because the Commissioner made clear that they seek continuity. I mean, you don't need me to tell you, Sophie, that for the hoteliers, for the tourist trade in many European member states, that this is an issue that they want to maintain the continuity approach. And this is exactly the sort of areas we've been discussing. There's already continuity arrangements, for example, on flights. But also this is where we need to move forward on things like data, because in terms of data around holidays, it's in the European firms' interest to have arrangements to enable data to be shared as well. So many of these issues are reciprocal. They affect the EU 27 member states as well as the UK. And it's important, whilst continuing to work towards a deal, that as part of our no deal preparation, we get sensible reciprocal arrangements in place, because it's in the EU's interest, just as it is in the UK's interest.
That doesn't always mean it happens, though, does it? Even if both sides want something to happen,
A lot
it doesn't always mean it happens.
So a lot has. So let me give you an example. Just last week, I was signing a deal with the Swiss authorities in terms of workers being able to move from the UK to Switzerland and vice versa. A couple of weeks ago, I was signing a deal with the Luxembourg Prime Minister in terms of voting rights in Luxembourg. We've got similar arrangements in Spain and Portugal. If you look at health, for example, 1.5% of the Irish health budget is from the NHS. They make a net £300 million from the UK in terms of health spend. So my point is, it's in both sides' interest to come to sensible early deals in terms of no deal, but obviously we're still working to try and reach a deal, and both leadership contenders, both Boris and Jeremy, have said that is their first priority.